my name is Joseph Brock, and welcome to the GMO Conversation, the podcast where my team and I will expand upon genetically modified organisms and their impact on different stakeholders. First, we want to tackle the definition of genetically modified organisms and the science behind them. Genetically modified organisms are organisms in which particular sections of DNA are altered so that the genes expressed are more desirable, such as drought resistance or pesticide tolerance, according to our source from GMOanswers.com. Any food we consume from the grocery store is either genetically modified or non-genetically modified. However, there are only 8 different types of foods approved for genetically modified production in the United States. According to the USDA Animal and Health Inspection Service, the genetically modified foods approved for use in the United States are corn, soybeans, potatoes, canola, papaya, squash, apple, and sugar beets. Our podcast series mostly focuses on genetically modified corn production since it is the most widely adopted genetically modified crop. In corn, the genes of plants are altered, and then when they produce seeds called kernels, they are sold to producers. Common genetically modified varieties of corn are BT corn, which are produced to be insect resistant. Other varieties are considered Roundup Ready, which means the genes expressed are resistant to Roundup, a common herbicide used to combat weeds in a crop. We chose groups of stakeholders which we thought could represent most of the population related to genetically modified organisms. The stakeholders we will be covering in this series will be environmentalists by Josh Blanchard, farmers by Michaela Slater, distributors by Tucker Lord, and lastly, consumers by Andrew Cassidy. All of the stakeholders chosen are directly impacted by genetically modified organisms in different and surprising ways. We also hope that the groups of stakeholders will expand the viewpoints of you, our listeners, beyond the group in which you belong. As part of our research, we interviewed Quint Pottinger, a farmer out of New Haven, Kentucky, who currently operates 1,500 acres there.
So most of what we're producing now is either has a Roundup Ready herbicide-resistant trait. We also have BT crops for corn for rootworm resistance. And we've currently explored producing Ohio Lake soybeans, which is a GM. So the advantage we have with the current genetics and the GMO crops we have now is we can reduce our herbicide applications, and it also helps us in reducing tillage. So we currently do zero tillage, which does 2 important things for us. It conserves nitrogen and water, especially with ground that may be more erodible. So we're not even breaking the ground, so we're not losing soil to the wind or to the creeks or heavy runoff, and so we're preserving the nutrients in the soil. And the last thing we're able to preserve is carbon, which is good. This serves 2 purposes. We need the carbon as a nutrient source for the plants. We also need to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. Yeah. So, yes. So you're more economically sustainable from a seed purchasing standpoint if you're non-GM, because the hybrids and genetics are different. You still have stock hybrids, especially in corn. Not so much in beans, but you still have genetic selections in non-GM crops. So there is some cost to seed, and there are still proprietary rights for seed in non-GM. So you may have to sign a contract with a company for non-GM seed, but and so the seed prices are lower, but you're going to make up for that by putting on more herbicides to control weeds, or because you can't use certain herbicides in non-GM crops or pesticides. And so you more than make up for that on the back end. So you may save on the front end on seed costs, but you'll make up for it on the back end on the chemical costs, and vice versa. With a GM crop, you're going to pay a lot more for the genetics, and so you're going to stack on all that technology up front, but you're not going to you're going to be able to use a different mode of action on your chemical side. Crazy. So it's about a wash. Evens out. This is an interesting question. I'm hoping, especially as a farmer, but more so as a consumer, especially as we see the world population start to increase in places that food insecurity is a big deal, is we'll see more genetics and more genetic modification step into the food industry and out of the row crop industry, which is where we can see the biggest gain. Like in fruits and vegetables, conserving water, being able to fruit in a shorter time period to we can adapt to different climates, in really food insecurity areas like Sub-Saharan Africa or India. And I think we're on the cusp of it, but we have to get over this consumer fear side and let the consumers read and be a part of the science, and not just say this is what it is. And I think that's the most exciting thing about what GM crops are bringing to the table. Also, with the climate, it's changing rapidly. Genetically modified crops, maybe not because of the genetic modification, but because of how they're being bred into certain 50 years worth of breeding a crop, whether it's genetic or not, we're going to be able to adapt to that climate. So it's going to be interesting next 50 years.
Yeah.
So you got your pros and cons with GM. The biggest pro is that we can reduce the use of pesticides, and we can increase productivity. But the downside of that is that if the farmer, or if the co-op, or if the extension agent, or the educator, or the adopter of the technology isn't aware of what happens when you mismanage the use of the technology, then we could lose the technology with weed resistance. You can't just go out, say, for a Roundup Ready soybean that we grow, you can't just put Roundup on it. That's not a cure-all. You have to use multiple, what we call in the industry, multiple modes of action. You have to be able to use certain chemicals, different chemicals with that Roundup every year to help control the weeds so they don't build up resistance. And that's education. Yeah. And so that's the biggest con about it, is that some farmers and some other people in the industry will use this as a quick out. It's cheap, let's do it, and let's use it for what it's worth, and we'll move on to the next thing. And that's not very sustainable from a social standpoint. And so, but the pros about it is we've reduced cost, so we're more economically sustainable now. We can produce food cheaper. We're more environmentally sustainable now because we can use less chemicals, even though we're using multiple modes of action. We're still using less chemicals overall, and those genetically modified crops are better nutrient efficient of using what's already in the soil, so it allows us to apply less inputs, less artificial fertilizers to get the same yield. Yeah. So, and this is going to be a big question, and I always tell people the food system's a lot more complicated. You can't just sum up what's happening in the food system by saying, well, it needs to be improved by this measure or that measure, because it's so integrated, and it's built on from a grassroots level up through the system. And in America especially, we're so bound to having food now, when we want it, how it's packaged, so specialized. But around the world, as I think genetics become more accepted and adopted, we'll start to see the consumer drive the demand of what's needed. Have you ever heard the saying, eat what's in season? Well, everything's in season now in America. As a matter of fact, most of the produce you eat in the wintertime comes out of Canada. It's grown in a greenhouse, whether it's genetically modified or not. Being mindful of what the environment's giving us, though, will help us drive what foods and what genetics will get put into the marketplace. Makes sense. As a farmer, I know that a lot of consumers have questions, and if there's anything that consumers want to know, especially on the genetic modified front, I try to be as open and honest as I possibly can. If you have any questions for me, I'd rather you come to the farmer with those questions and have a good objective conversation about where the industry's going, where we've been and where we're headed, than to just type in Google a question and just accept what spits out, because it may line up with your philosophy better. So I'm here for anything you ever need.
Hello, my name is Joshua Blanchard, and I'll be your host today here on the GMO Conversation. We thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Now, we've all heard how modern agriculture can cause serious negative effects on the environment. But what about one specific aspect of modern farming? This being GMOs. When people discuss GMOs, they often voice their concern about potential effects they may have on human health, but we never hear about GMOs' effects on the environment. Well, in this episode, we'll get down to the nitty-gritty as we talk about GMOs from an environmentalist standpoint. When it comes to environmentalist views on GMOs, we find a gray area. They don't have one clear answer whether they are for or whether they are against GMOs. This happens because there are many aspects that are beneficial and also detrimental when it comes to GMOs' effects on the environment. First off, let's take a look at some of the positive aspects. Now, another aspect of modern agriculture that we often hear a lot of public outcry from is the use of pesticides and insecticides. In an article titled Impacts from Pesticides on Health from the Pesticide Action Network UK, we find that the use of pesticides and insecticides can have severe detrimental effects on not only populations of natural enemies, but also numerous other species in the surrounding environment. And on a side note, they can also cause human health problems. from cancer all the way to respiratory issues. Now, this is one place where GMOs can step in and make a big impact on the environment. In an article titled Genetically Engineered Crops Help Support Conservation Biological Control, Jorg Romeis discusses the insecticidal proteins used in GM crops and how they cause no unintended adverse effects to natural enemies. And when used instead of synthetic chemical insecticides for target pest control, they can create an environment that supports the conservation of natural enemies. But that's not all. Graham Brooks and Peter Barfoot's article titled Environmental Impacts of Genetically Modified Crop Use, 1996 to 2015, shares a deeper look into what GM crops can do when it comes to pesticides. They go on to explain that GM insect-resistant and herbicide-tolerant crops have reduced pesticide spray by 618.7 million kilograms, and by doing this, it has decreased the environmental impact associated with herbicide and insecticide. That alone is an amazing statistic. To put it into perspective, an average semi-truck weighs around 36,000 kilograms. So if we divide the amount of pesticide spray that was not used due to the use of GM crops by the weight of a semi, we get that the amount of pesticide that was not sprayed due to the use of GM crops is equivalent to the weight of around 17,100 semi-trucks. There's also another way that GMOs help the environment, and that is by reducing the usage of fuel. In the same article by Graham Brooks and Peter Barfoot, they explain that with the use of GM crops, farmers significantly reduce the amount of fuel they use due to not having to make spray runs and by changing to reduced tillage or no tillage practices that are often used in GM crop production. This had a huge impact on the amount of carbon dioxide which is released into the environment. And this can be seen in the following quote from Brooks and Barfoot's paper. Over the period from 1996 to 2015, the cumulative permanent reduction in fuel has been around 26,221 million kilograms of carbon dioxide, arising from reduced fuel use of 9,823 million liters. In terms of car equivalents, this is equal to taking 11.65 million cars off the road for a year. Obviously, such a significant drop in greenhouse gas emissions has improved the environment tremendously. Now, everything is not sunshine and rainbows when it comes to GMOs in the environment. In an article titled Environmental Risks from GeneWatch UK, they give a few main points where GM crops can severely damage the environment. The first is that wild plants may end up harboring the genetically modified genes found in GM crops, which could potentially reshape the entire ecosystem in that area. They also tell us that things called superweeds may take over certain environments. Now, although GM crops reduce the use of insecticide and pesticide use, they don't stop the use of weed killer. And in areas in the US and South America, the weeds that are not killed by these weed killers are taking over areas and are hard to eradicate since they do not die from said weed killers. One last way that GMOs negatively affect the environment is that farmland wildlife populations have decreased heavily due to the new toxins found in GM crop areas, as well as new farming practices that are used with GM crop production. And this can be seen in the following quote from the GeneWatch UK paper. In the USA, a 90% reduction in populations of the iconic monarch butterfly have been reported to be caused largely by loss of habitat due to blanket spraying of Roundup-ready GM crops with the weed killer glyphosate. So as you can see, environmentalists don't have an easy time choosing which side of the GMO argument they want to be on. On one hand, they see many environmental benefits brought on by GMOs, like reduced fuel usage and reduced pesticide use. Yet, on the other hand, they see the destruction GMOs can bring onto the environment, such as the extirpation of certain species in an area, and also the potential of superweeds to take over an environment. So for them, it's a tough choice. But you know it's not a tough choice? Sticking around to hear our next episode. Again, my name is Joshua Blanchard, and I thank you for listening to the episode of GMO Conversation, and we'll see you next time.
Hey everyone, I'm Michaela Slater, and you are listening to episode 3 of the GMO Conversation. In this episode, I will be discussing the farming industry as a stakeholder in the topic of GMOs. The farming industry is a very important stakeholder for our topic because they directly interact with the genetically modified crops. Unlike some of our other stakeholders, the topic of GMOs is very polarized amongst the farming industry. In this episode, I want to talk about some main problems or solutions that GMOs provide for farmers. The first point I want to discuss is how GMOs make no-till or minimum-till farming a possibility and what that does for the farming industry. Tilling a field means that topsoil is turned over and new soil is exposed for planting crops. This is done primarily as a form of weed control, but it has many consequences. As the soil is loosened, it can lead to soil erosion, runoff into waterways, and consumption of large amounts of fuel for the equipment needed. Crops that are genetically modified to be resistant to weeds open up alternative to traditional tillage. They provide another way to control weeds other than just covering them up. And an article by Nicholas Staropoli titled "No-Till Agriculture Offers Vast Sustainability Benefits, So Why Do Many Organic Farmers Reject It?" Staropoli discusses the benefits that no-till agriculture can have. He says that no-till can reduce fuel use by as much as 80%. He also makes points about how crop residue left in the topsoil helps to eliminate erosion, increase water retention in the soil, and increases carbon absorption by plants and the soil. The next thing I want to talk about is how GMOs offer a higher crop yield and more profitable outcome for farmers. An article I found on the Oxford Research Encyclopedia's website titled "Pros and Cons of GMO Crop Farming" discusses this point. The article states, GM crops with resistance to insects and herbicides can substantially simplify crop management and reduce crop losses, leading to increased yields. GM varieties of soybean, cotton, and maize produce 20%, 15%, and 7% higher yields respectively than non-GM varieties. GMOs help to protect plants, leading to higher amount of crops making it to the market. On the other hand, GM crops might not be affordable for all farmers. GM seeds are more expensive than non-GM seeds, so while GMOs could lead to profit in the future, some farmers simply can't afford to start growing them in the first place. Another point I want to discuss is the use of pesticides and herbicides in relation to GMOs. As I have already mentioned, GMOs can be bred to be more resistant to weeds and pests, as crops are bred to be tolerant of certain pesticides and herbicides, so when farmers spray their fields, pests and weeds will be killed, but the crops will be unharmed. The most common of these crops are called Roundup-ready crops, and they're tolerant of glyphosate. A big push for these crops is that they reduce the number of chemicals that need to be used. Instead of multiple sprayings for the same season, farmers can use only 1 or 2 products and know that their crops will be safe. Some of the benefits of these GM crops are reducing farmers' exposure to chemicals, reducing residue on crops, and just using less chemicals in general. On the flip side, a big fear associated with these crops is that weeds and pests will become resistant to the chemicals used on them. Because GM crops are made tolerant of certain chemicals, those chemicals are used in abundance. The Oxford Research Encyclopedia's article states that the extensive use of limited number of pesticides facilitated by GM crops does accelerate the evolution of resistant pest populations. Since so many GM crops are bred to be glyphosate tolerant, the chemical glyphosate is being used at a very high rate. Eventually, weeds and pests will become resistant to this chemical, at which point an alternative, possibly more dangerous chemical, will need to be used. The last point I want to touch on is the interaction between corporations and farmers. In an article by farmaid.org titled "GMOs, Top 5 Concerns of Family Farmers," they talk extensively about the control that large corporations have on the GMO industry. They say that, today, just 4 companies control almost 60% of the seed market. Those 4 big companies are Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, and Dow. When farmers buy seeds from these companies, they are signing legal contracts with them, many of which control the way crops are grown and include expenses on top of the price of seeds. A fear of non-GMO farmers is that of contamination of their fields. If GMO seeds are pollinated or spread into non-GMO fields, those farmers can face severe consequences. The Farm Aid article states that contamination can spark dramatic economic losses for farmers who face rejection from export markets that ban GMOs. Organic farmers suffering contamination can lose their organic certification at the premium they earn for their organic crop. And while contamination can happen through no fault of their own, farmers have been sued for seed piracy when unauthorized GMO crops show up in their fields. That's all I have for this episode. Thank you for listening, and make sure to tune in next time on the GMO Conversation.
Hello, my name is Tucker Lord, and I will be discussing the production and distribution of GMOs. A common myth of GMOs is that the cost and production and distribution cost more than regular crops. With the research that I did, I found that GMOs are safer and cost, if not less, just as much as non-genetically modified crops. With the cost of crops depending on many conditions like the weather, transportation costs, and temperature changes, GMOs help lower the price change as much as possible. The research that I did helped me explore many ways that GMOs are used in the production of food and the crops they come from. Also, my research focused on the making of GMOs, which are made from microbes and many other microscopic organisms that are then put into the plant for a specific purpose or use. Also, the article that I did my research states that if it wasn't for GMOs, the price of corn-based products would have risen 6% and soybean-based products would have risen 10%. Although it takes more technology to maintain and grow genetically modified crops, it pays itself off by having 122 million more tons of soybeans than previous years and 237 million tons of corn grown. So yes, although it costs more to maintain and grow genetically modified plants, your yield rate is higher than non-GMO plants. With the use of GMOs, you'll lose less crops to natural causes, and you'll have better yield rates of that crop. Along with the distribution of GMOs, I also did the production side. With the research that I did on the production, I found that GMOs are made by selectively cultivating plants for specific trait, for example, how many seeds it produces or how it can survive in certain conditions. When creating a GMO, scientists look at a plant or other organisms such as microbes for a certain desired trait. And once they identify what trait they want, it then starts the process of extracting that trait from the original plant or microbe into the new plant. After the process of extraction, introducing the gene into the new plant, it is then extensively tested, and researchers look for differences in between the genetically modified and the original plant. Before a genetically modified plant reaches market, it goes through many safety tests to be sure they are safe for humans, animals, and the environment. When all the safety tests are concluded, the data is reviewed by 3 regulatory agencies in the U.S., the USDA, EPA, and the FDA. And when the plant is passed by these agencies, it can go to market. GMOs, although the cost of GMO seeds are more expensive, the maintenance on the plants are less expensive by less watering. In conclusion, a lot goes into the production and distribution of genetically modified crops, with the genetically modified plants that we use today provide more yield rates and less maintenance.
Hi there, my name is Andrew Cassidy, and on today's episode, number 5 of the GMO conversation, we'll be talking about the consumers in regards to the entirety of our argument. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'd like to go over the main points of what I'd like to talk about today. The first point that I'd like to go over today is the lack of consensus in the scientific community over the GMO buy argument. There is the pro-GMO and there is the anti-GMO argument, and what you'll see later is the scientific community believes there's not enough information to conclude anything about that. And then also, I want to bring that to the consumer and think, well, if you have a lot of money, then you might not want to take the risk and buy GMOs. But if you do have the money, don't have the money, you can weigh the risk, and then also that's the point of GMOs. They're meant to save money. So we're going to be going over that today. So now it's time to talk about my first point, which is the lack of scientific consensus on the debate. According to an article from the International Journal of Biological Sciences, they state pretty excessively and pretty firmly that in the scientific community, there is really not a consensus on this GMO debate. And as a consumer, that's something that you should really know. From companies, you see a lot of marketing from companies about this debate, and what the consumer should know is that the debate's not even close to being over. So it's something really important to know. After talking about the scientific community's perspective on this debate, I like to let's go to the supermarket now, and let's go over a couple facts real quick. The first fact that I'd like to present to you consumers out there is that it is not a federal requirement to label something as GMO or non-GMO. So please be aware of this and know that when a company labels this, they're doing this on purpose. They don't have to. So think about what the consequences or side effects of that could be. And a second fact is that, did you know that 70% of all packaged foods in the U.S. are made or contain GMOs or GMO byproducts? This is something pretty important to know as a consumer. And now let's talk about the wallets. So now that we're in the market, the supermarket, let's continue this conversation, but from the consumer's wallet. So imagine you're someone who doesn't have to worry about what food they buy. So they buy the non-GMO food, and that's understandable. I mean, there's not, like we said before, there's not a consensus on this debate. So if you don't want to take the risk and you have the money to afford it, please go ahead. And now, but also, imagine if you're someone who can't afford the non-GMO food. Well, that's the point of GMO. I mean, it's supposed to save money for the business and for you. So please don't be ashamed of that. It is the point of GMOs to save you and the business money. So I say go for it. Please do. Thank you so much for listening to my episode number 5, Consumer of the GMO Conversation. And on the next episode of the GMO Conversation, we're going to be going through our group podcast.
Welcome to the final episode of the GMO Conversation. In this episode, we will be reintroducing ourselves and saying which topics of stakeholders we covered, as well as expressing our own personal opinions backed with research. My name is Joseph Brock, and I covered the introductory episode in our interview with Quint Pottinger.
And my name's Joshua Blanchard, and I covered the environmentalist stakeholder.
My name is Michaela Slater, and I covered episode 3, the farming industry stakeholder.
My name is Tucker Lord, and I did the production and distribution stakeholder.
And my name is Andrew Cassidy, and I did the 5th episode on the consumer standpoint.
Hopefully this podcast series has broadened your horizons of GMOs and got you to think outside of just the specific group of stakeholders you belong to. And I think that's the biggest thing to keep in mind as we proceed into the future with GMOs and expanding the science of agriculture. And I just think it's important to keep in mind how the other stakeholder groups are impacted beyond just yourself before you make those judgment calls. And in my interview with Quint Pottinger, he made it a big point to say to get out and talk to farmers, talk to people who are working with genetically modified organisms every day and see what their opinion is on it before you really solidify your own opinion.
You know, when it comes to GMOs, I kind of have the same point of view as my stakeholder did, which is why I'm really happy that I got placed with my stakeholder I had. I consider myself an avid environmentalist, and really looking at GMOs from a big picture, they do have an overall good benefit to the environment. And I hope my episode kind of opened your eyes to the possibilities and some of the aspects that GMOs do bring onto the environment, because it's not something that's really shown in mainstream media today. Like I pointed out, a lot of times all you hear is public concerns about potential health problems or pretty much the price of GMOs and stuff related to that, but you never really do hear about the effects that these crops have on the environment. And like I said, while a lot of it is good, there also is some negative aspects. So when you're really trying to make your decision on whether you are for or against the GMOs and the use of these crops, I really think you should also take the environment into the picture and really open up your horizons when you're trying to make your decision.
My overall stance is that GMOs provide much more positive things to the world than they do negative. Throughout my research, I found the benefits that it can provide through no-till farming, using less herbicides and pesticides, increasing crop yields for just mainstream people and for farmers in general, and better soil, cleaner air, cleaner water. Just overall, I think that it has a very positive effect. The negatives that I found in my research just didn't overshadow it enough for me. I think that they can do really good things for the world, and I think that they do really good things for the world.
So coming into this research project, I really didn't have an opinion, but with the stakeholder that I was assigned, which was the production and distribution, it broadened my spectrum of thinking on the whole GMO topic. The way it did this was it showed me how GMOs are made, and then it showed me what the positive effects of the GMOs have on the food market. Like I said in my episode, that there's 122 million more tons of soybeans produced, and then 237 million more tons of corn grown because of GMOs. And then that formed my opinion over the whole GMOs, that they're good and that the positive outweighs the negative, especially in the production and the distribution. There's just so much more good that comes from GMOs that us as a society would completely benefit, like we are now, from the use of GMOs. So to wrap up, that my opinion on GMOs is that people have a misconception of they see this new product coming out and they see that most new things aren't good, but with the GMOs, how extensively tested they are, that there's really no harm in using them.
So, my opinion after episode 5, the consumer standpoint of this GMO debate, I really don't have one. And I believe that was showed through my stakeholder, where there wasn't really consensus on this argument. But as someone who is a college student who does not have that much money, I am going to go on the side of GMOs just because it is friendly on my wallet, and there is really no way to escape GMOs nowadays anyway. So it seems as though I don't have an option that much, and I also don't have the money. So we shall see, but I think it's going to be all right.
That's about all that we have for you guys. Thank you for listening to our podcast. This has been the GMO Conversation.